So the plan for today is just to pick up where we left off last time, which is talking about the classical view of concepts. And last time we talked about what the view is and why people like it. This time we're going to shift to the second bit, which is why, despite all the despite all the people who liked it for a long time and all its benefits, these days just about nobody accepts the classical theory of concepts as is. So before we get into that, though, let's just do a quick review. I said I wanted to start this part of class by covering some of the things we talked about last time and reviewing them. So let's review. What is a concept? What are we talking about in psychology, or what do psychologists mean when they talk about concepts?
Building blocks of thought.
Yeah, they're the building blocks of thought. They're basically the symbols in the head that get combined together when you think. And part of the reason that we think that concepts are so, one of the reasons that we think they're there is it seems that one of the features of human thought is we're capable of thinking things that nobody's ever thought before by combining our thoughts parts together in new ways. So like until this moment, you've probably never thought of a pink polar bear. But you're able to think of a pink polar bear because you have the concept pink and you have the concept polar bear, and you can stick them together. And so that's why we think of concepts, is they're these building blocks out of which we can combine really complex thoughts. So why should we care about concepts? What are the various things that they allow us to discuss or allow us to explain? I just gave one of the answers, is they allow us to explain why human thought is so powerful and expansive. But what are some other things about concepts that, or some other things that people like to talk about in psychology that concepts are involved
in? Sorry. I was just gonna say we talked about like interpersonal like relationships, like learning.
Yep, learning, interpersonal relationships, just about because concepts are so tied in with all thought, it's really hard to talk about any sort of psychological phenomenon without talking about concepts. And because concepts are so tied in with every phenomenon, it's going to be the case that if you care about these things, if you care about how learning works, either in a scientific sense or in the I want my child to learn really well in school sense, or I want to be better at learning new things, it's helpful to know what concepts are and what they're like, where they come from, how they get built. The more of that you know, the more you can then take that information about concepts and apply it to other areas we care about. All right, so what are the key features of concepts? We said they're the building blocks of thought, but what are some of the key characteristics that define concepts, or the key features that anything must have if it's a concept? We've already said they have to be able to be combined together, but what are some of the other things? I'm not sure whether I did a good job highlighting these last time, but I wanted to bring it up here again.
I'm just guessing, I think, but
yeah.
Are they structured?
Yeah, so they have to be structured in some sense. That's one thing we want, is we want them to be structured and can be complex. So one thing we want to say about all concepts is that they're structured things that can be complex. Something else we might want to say is what? Well, this is one I didn't highlight last time enough, so I want to bring it up here, is concepts are about things in the world. So it's not just like you have a concept bunny rabbit. It's rather that by having the concept bunny rabbit, you're able to have a thought about bunny rabbits. What is it to have a thought about bunny rabbit? Well, it's just to have a thought that one of the concepts that makes that thought up is the bunny rabbit concept. And so we need to understand, if to have a thought about bunny rabbits, let's see if I can draw a bunny rabbit. It's kind of bunny-like. It's not the worst drawing. To have a thought about a bunny rabbit, it seems like we need some way to explain how a thought is, or how a concept is about a bunny rabbit, or what makes this concept your bunny rabbit concept, such that anytime you, to use the term from a few times ago, token this mental symbol in your mind, it counts as having a thought about bunny rabbits. So another key feature of concepts is they're about things in the world, and they're about things in the world that are like beyond our minds, like not just things in the world as in like the head is in the world, therefore concepts are in the world. I mean, like concepts are a mental thing about the non-mental world, and we need some understanding of how it is that your concept counts as about a bunny rabbit, or what it is about your concept of love that makes it about love, or something like that. What are some other things that we said about concepts?
They can be broken down.
Yeah, so they're broken down into smaller parts, and a key feature of that, so this is kind of tied in with the structured and complex, but we need to be able to understand how they can be broken down. And then the flip side of that is how, or that they can be built up. How, let's just put, can be built up. So another key feature of concepts, as well as them being able to be broken down into their simpler parts, another thing seems to be that we can build new concepts or learn new concepts by taking old parts. And so any theory of concepts that we have wants to explain how it is that we can talk about them as having parts in some sense, but also then how it is that we can learn new ones very often by combining those parts together to form new concepts. So in the way that you can form, if you have the concept of like a horn and you have the concept of a horse, you can create the concept unicorn in your mind. And so we want an explanation of how you learn that new concept. So those are the key ideas that I wanted to stress for what is important about concepts, or what the key features are. And now with that in mind, let's go back to what's the classical theory, and then why is it that people liked the classical theory. And really the main reason for this fifth one is why people liked it is it gives a lot of straightforward answers to the things we want concepts to do. But first off, what do we say the classic theory is? How does it conceive of a concept? What sort of other thing is it like?
Is it like basically like a definition? So if it's
Exactly.
a cat, like what is the cat? And then you describe like it has a tail and stuff.
Exactly. So I'm going to erase these just so I can put this up. So what it basically thinks of, what the classical view is that a concept is akin to a definition in a dictionary or anything else. So what is your concept cat? Here's your concept cat, and then contained in it or tied in with it are other concepts like animal, cute, things like this. And here's the point I want to stress, which I didn't want to I didn't bring up last time, but I want to bring up this time, is the way to think of this is on a classical view, what it is, what these parts of the concept are, is they give what are called necessary and sufficient conditions for being a what's the best way of being a for the concept applying correctly. So how many people have heard this phrase, necessary and sufficient conditions? I'm sure you in philosophy may have, some of you who are philosophy majors have heard of these. What is a necessary and a sufficient condition? Well, let's just break down the words. What does it mean for something to be necessary?
You need it.
You need it. So necessary is need. So it's something that must be the case. And then what is something that's sufficient? Anyone know sufficient? Enough, yes. Sufficient means enough. So it's just enough of something. So for instance, oxygen is necessary to survive. And then what is, there are, another thing you need is food. Food is necessary to survive. But how much food is sufficient to survive? That's what we mean by sufficient. Or like, if you want to feed your cat enough to survive, 1 cup of food is sufficient for survival. Now, what does this have to do with definitions? Well, whenever you're giving a definition of something, and this applies anywhere, and this is just a useful skill in any sort of time you're asked to give a definition, what you want to do is give the conditions that anything of that type needs to have, and also conditions that are sufficient to differentiate that sort of thing from anything else. So as you give somebody these conditions, they'll be able to identify examples of this type. So to make it very clear, let's go with the mathematical definition of square. What is the mathematical definition of square? What is a square?
4 equal sides and
Four.
4 right angles.
4 equal sides, 4 right angles, and closed 2D figure. Now, these are necessary and sufficient conditions for something's being a square. Now, why are they necessary? Well, anything that is a square has to have all of these conditions. So you cannot be a square if you do not have 4 equal sides. If you have 4 sides, but they're not equal, you don't get to count as a square. This is necessary. However, this alone is not enough to differentiate squares from other types of shapes. What other types of shapes have 4 equal sides? Anyone? Back to our geometry.
It's rectangles.
So not all rectangles have 4 equal sides. Anyone remember?
A diamond would count?
Yeah,
That's just
the fun term is rhombus, I think was, yeah, rhombus. So yeah, a rhombus also has 4 equal sides. So this is a necessary condition on being a square, but it is not sufficient to capture squares because this doesn't differentiate squares from other types of rhombuses. So it's only 4 equal sides and 4 right angles. So the idea is, and why is this important? Why are necessary and sufficient conditions useful? Well, because if you have the necessary and sufficient conditions that define something, you can easily identify what counts as one of those things and what doesn't. So if you've got the necessary and sufficient conditions for a new shape, like if I were to tell you like the necessary definition or the necessary and sufficient conditions for being an equilateral pentagram, penta is 5 equal sides. Wait, is pentagram the one that's like devil worship, or is that the?
Yeah.
Okay, what's the one that's actually the math shape?
Pentagon?
Pentagon, there we go. Yeah, not the devil worship one. Although I guess you could say what's the necessary and sufficient conditions on being a pentagram is to be a 5 equal sided star within a circle. That would be the necessary and sufficient conditions of a pentagram. And now, if I gave you a whole picture, like a bunch of different pictures, if you had those necessary and sufficient conditions, you'd easily be able to pick the pentagrams out from the pentagons. So that's why necessary and sufficient conditions are useful. So what a classical view is it's not just giving like some characteristic features. The classical view thinks of concepts as sets of necessary and sufficient conditions of what it takes to apply that concept correctly. So the classical view of the cat, like our concept cat, is whatever the necessary and sufficient conditions are for counting as a cat. So it would be things like mammal, feline, DNA, or whatever else it would be. But these are the definitions of, these would be the conditions. And now you'd be able, if I gave you something new, like if I gave you a dog, you'd be able to see, okay, it is a mammal, but it doesn't have the correct sort of DNA. This isn't a cat. I apply my concept differently. So that's generally speaking what the view is. It thinks of concepts as sets of necessary and sufficient conditions for counting as a member of the class that the concept picks out. Does everyone understand just like the general way? And necessary and sufficient, I bring this up in large part because whenever you're writing a paper for a philosophy class or any other class and you're asked to give a definition of something, try to give close to necessary and sufficient conditions for it. So don't just say like, ethics is an important thing. Well, yes, that's true. That is a necessary condition, but it doesn't differentiate ethics from everything else. So if you're taking an ethics class and you're defining ethics, make sure to give conditions that are sufficient from differentiating it. All right, so that's what the classical view is. Now, what were some of the benefits we talked about last time? Why is it that the classical view of concepts dominated most people's thinking in psychology, philosophy, everything for like 2,000 years? There's a bunch of different ones. What sorts of things do we have easy explanations for if you accept the classical view?
How
Simplicity.
learning works.
Oh, we had two different ones. I'm not sure who said which one. So Alan, go first and then
I
Conrad.
said how learning works.
Yeah, learning is one. We have a very simple explanation of learning. Conrad, what did you say?
I said simplicity.
So yeah, the other thing is it's a very simple / intuitive picture. Because it seems like when you're trying to decide, so let's go backwards. If you're trying to decide, like, is this a cat? It seems like what you're doing is you're taking your characteristic features of cat and seeing if the thing in front of you meets those criteria. And then learning is very simple to explain because if each concept is made up of smaller parts, then all it is to learn a new concept is combine parts you already have in new ways. Also explains why we always have to learn simple things before we learn more complex things. What were some of the other benefits or advantages of the classical view that people often pointed to?
Was one of them categorization?
Yes, it gives us a really nice, simple way of categorizing. And what do we mean by this? Why is this so useful? Well, one of the things about the world is you only really learn something about something else if you know what categories it falls into. So if I just present you with something and you don't know anything about it, then you can't really predict how it's going to behave or how it's going to act. But the moment I tell you that, like, it's a cockroach, you're going to begin to know, like, oh, I know what cockroaches are like. So if you say that the classical view is what it takes to count as a cockroach is to meet the certain criteria, and then anything that meets those criteria is a cockroach. Now, learning that something's a cockroach gives you a very nice bunch of things you can predict about it. Like, it's going to scurry away from the light. It's going to, like, be creepy looking. You're going to want to kill it miserably. Like, all of these sorts of things are things you can do as soon as you know it's a cockroach. And the classical view gives you a very nice, straightforward explanation for why and how we characterize things. One last thing I want to say that I didn't stress enough last time is it explains the aboutness of concepts. And so one of the things that we said is so important about concepts is that they allow us to have thoughts about things in the world. And there's something deeply mysterious about how something in your head can be about something in the world. But if you take the classical view, you have a pretty straightforward explanation for why something out in the world would count as a member or as something that the concept applies to. And basically what you do is you just apply the definition. So back to square, 4 equal sides, 4 90-degree angles. Well, with this definition, because this is what it takes to count as a square, now anything out in the world that meets these criteria is going to count as a square, and your concept is going to be about that thing. So what is it to have why is it the case that you can say, that's a square, that's true, I can now learn things about squares? Well, it's because your concept in some sense gives the conditions that need to be true for anything ever to count as a square, and therefore to be an object of that thought. So another way of putting that is, give me 1 second. Or another way to highlight this is the classical definition allows us to explain why it seems that we can apply our concepts incorrectly. So what do I mean by this? Here's a behavior that we all need to account for or need to explain. It's kind of fuzzy in the distance. You think you see a person coming towards you, and you get closer, and you realize it was a lamp post because it was foggy. So at the time, before you got close enough to tell it was a lamp post, you had the thought, that's a person. Or more accurately, so using concept terms, you applied your concept or put the perceptual image that you're having right now, that thing I'm seeing, and you said, that's a person. However, in some sense, you were wrong. And we want to be able to say that we can apply concepts incorrectly. To explain human behavior, it seems like sometimes what you need to do to explain someone's behavior is say they misapplied a concept. Well, how is it that you can explain misapplying a concept? Well, in the classical view, it's pretty straightforward. To count as an actual instance of something is to meet the definition of it. And in these misapplication cases, you're saying or trying to say that thing I'm seeing right now, that one right there, falls under the concept, but really it doesn't meet the necessary criteria. So do you see how thinking about things in terms of definitions gives us a very straightforward way of thinking, what is it to have a thought about something in the world? And also, what is it to misidentify an actual thing in the world as something it is not? Does this make sense?
So
Great.
it allows us to categorize and allows us to miscategorize and understand why we miscategorize.
Exactly. So we want to, if you want to give a good psychological theory, you need to not only explain what's happening when we get it right, but also what's happening when we get it wrong, because human beings, as a matter of fact, get things wrong. And the classical theory gives a really nice, straightforward explanation for what it is to get it wrong and why it's gone wrong. So yes.
That's making sense of the era.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's the sort of thing where like, if we only were able to explain what's going on when humans get it right, we wouldn't explain a lot of human behaviors, because as a matter of fact, humans make lots of errors. And so we want our psychological theory to have room for those errors. And this one has nice room for that error. It gives a straightforward explanation of why does it count as a misapplication of the concept? So why does that thing count? It really is a cat. And why does it count as like an incorrect application of the concept? Well, the thing that we've applied it to doesn't actually meet the criteria for being a cat. All right, so that's all the background stuff. That's all the positive, yay, classical theory stuff and why it's such a dominant view. And honestly, the things that the classical theory gets right, none of the replacement views have been as good as the classical theory at explaining some of these things. The problem is that the classical theory has a number of very big issues with it. Issues that people have come to think that we need to totally reconsider what concepts are and not think of them as definitions. So there are a bunch of different problems in the reading that got talked about. Some of them I put big X's over so you didn't have to read them. Does anyone want to say what one of the problems with the classical view is that they want to talk about first, or anything like that? Because now I just want to open it up and see which we can go in any order in terms of what the problems are. Or I can just like push ahead and choose one.
Could we do the Plato's problem one?
Yeah, Plato's problem is a very good one. Plato's problem. This is basically one of the most fundamental issues with any sort of definitional approach to just about anything. So how many of you have read Plato? Anyone, just out of curiosity? Okay. So what does Plato have Socrates spend most of his time doing in a dialogue? He just like picks some big important idea, and then they spend the rest of the entire dialogue coming up with a definition for it. And it seems like every definition this person puts forward, there's some counterexample to it or some issue. So at the core, what Plato's problem is that it seems impossible to give necessary and sufficient conditions outside math. So, yeah, they always end in aporia, which, as Holland, is what Holland just said, and aporia is just this sense of, well, we're kind of in a state of confusion and we don't really know what to do next, and we've just thought about it really hard, and it's like that kind of deeply satisfying and deeply unsatisfying moment you reach after you've thought about something really hard and not come to a satisfying conclusion. All right, so why do I say that it's impossible to come up with good, necessary, and sufficient conditions? Well, here's the classic case. This is a case that comes from Wittgenstein, writing in the it came out in the 1950s. Game. What is a game? How many of you think you have a good understanding of what a game is intuitively? Like, I think I do. If I watch people playing something, I think I can identify when somebody is playing a game and when somebody's not. But game is almost impossible to define. So let's try. Let's try as a class to come up with a definition of this simple English word game. What counts as a game? And the goal, remember, is to come up with a definition that gives us the necessary and sufficient conditions of a game. So we want a condition that every game has and a set of conditions that only games have. So let's try. What counts as a game?
It's entertaining.
Entertaining.
Rules to play by.
And has rules. So right off the bat, these are definitely things that I think apply to games. But if you ask my father, very many games, my father's the only person I've ever met. He hates every board game he has ever encountered in his entire life. Trying to get him to play a board game is impossible. And the few times we've played, it's just no fun because he's in such like a deep state of misery. It's like everybody else ends up in that deep state of misery. So for him, there are many games that are not entertaining. Also, there are many things that have rules that are not games. Competitive. So it seems like there are many games that are competitive, but how many people have played those like newfangled board games where like you and everybody else works together to beat the game? Or another one is like solitaire. Like, who are you competing against in solitaire? Solitaire, you're playing with like, also, I've played a game of War before. You know War, like the dumbest card game ever? I've played it against myself many times. Where like I was really bored and I had a deck of cards. So the goal of the game is to have fun in a lot of these cases. So this is the entertaining fun bit. So it seems like what happens is a lot of games are designed to be fun, but there are other games that I think like certain sports or like gladiatorial games where like people fight each other to the death. It's not really fun for everybody. Like, in fact, somebody's gonna die. So yeah, and another thing, Holland says, some things are fun without fun being the purpose of them. So the goal of games is to be fun. And so let's say goal is entertainment. So the goal of a game is entertaining or to be fun or to be enjoyable. The problem here is that it seems, one, that there are some games that are not necessarily designed to be fun or entertaining, like war games are training for the army that are designed specifically to be very grueling and exhausting. And we want to say that's a game in some sense. But also there are many things whose goal is to be entertaining that we don't want to say is fun. A game is a set of actions being performed by a player, singular or plural, to reach some goal or resolution which brings meaning to their actions. That is a very good definition, Conrad. The problem, I think, might be that a lot of things which we intuitively wouldn't call a game would fall under this definition. So for instance, a interpretive dance, I think, would be a set of actions performed by person, singular, plural. War fits that definition. This class would be, and so what you see is just about the fact that we're having like doing this many backflips really proves the point of Plato's problem, which is we are supposed to be able to give necessary and sufficient conditions for our concept. So the idea is supposed to be, what is it to apply the concept game? Well, we have a bunch of criteria, A, B, C. And what we do is we go down and see if this thing meets all these criteria, it counts as a game. And yet what we find is we can't even come up with the criteria. And how can you define a game if, yeah, the other thing with games, it seems like just about anything can be a game if you like call it a game, which kind of flips the whole thing on its head. It seems like this is assuming we have a definition first, and then what we can do is go around and see what counts as a game and what doesn't. But it seems like, as a matter of fact, very often things go the other way. We kind of have this concept game to begin with, and then what is it to become a game? We then apply this concept on things. And so if we want to apply the concept game to life, then life is now a game. If we want to apply it to like stabbing yourself in the hand with a knife, that is now a game. Like whatever counts as a game is a game if you call it a game. And so this is the first, Plato's problem, the first issue is very few things outside of mathematics have necessary and sufficient conditions that you can easily and straightforwardly say. And because the classical view of concepts assumes that to be a concept is to be something with necessary and sufficient conditions, it seems like we just don't have the right level of detail for the classical theory to capture the way we actually think. So it's clear that, like, let's take for granted that we've got concepts and that we do apply them correctly, and that people, like, we all know that like chess is a game, and we all know that like sleeping is less of a game than chess. I can imagine a case in which sleeping could become a game, but usually it's less of a game. And so the classical view cannot capture the fact that we all are on the same page. I think the problem is trying to find the perfect definition is the world is not as structured and defined as mathematics. Even types of animals can't be classified so clearly. It's hard to tell if animals are two species or two subspecies. Holland, basically, read the chat because Holland just put into very nice language exactly the core point of this. The core point is just that the world as it exists and the world that we apply our concepts to is not clean cut. And yet the classical view assumes that it is. And so because the world's not so clear cut, our concepts, whatever they are, can't be on the classical view. We need another concept of how concepts work. So that's the first problem. That's Plato's problem. I now want to jump onto the fuzziness problem because it's very closely related. So the fuzziness problem is this idea that if the classical view was correct, being a member or being something that a concept should apply to is a straightforward yes-no thing. So like in mathematics, give me 1 second, Holland, to digest this. Holland says, but the classical theory of concepts could explain how people think, even if they think in a way that doesn't reflect the reality perfectly. So I think that there's something very true to this, which is that people do generally like to think there are definitions for things. The problem is that the classical view, even if we take it for granted that there are elements of it that people think in that way and think there are definitions for things, the issue is that it cannot be that the way we're actually going about applying them is going, like the classical theory is committed to the view that the way you decide whether something is a member or that a concept applies to some individual is you look at the definition and then you apply it step by step. So in the case of like cat, what you do is you'd apply A, B, C, etc. But the point of the Plato's problem is to show that this doesn't really work because it doesn't look like we have a set of clear-cut definitions for a lot of our concepts. Now, I do agree that and a lot of people have tried to like keep this part of the classical view in that it does seem like a lot of the time we have some criteria that we associate with something. Like there are certain features of being a game that we take as core and look for when we're trying to decide if something's a game. So the idea with people being ineffective thinkers would be that maybe underlying it, there is this perfect concept. It's just that people are incorrectly applying their definitions in practice or having trouble accessing those definitions.
Could I add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is super good.
Yeah, I feel like I actually would agree with that last part because there are certain, like, I feel like it's a limitation of language, if anything, because there are certain words in other languages that have no correspondence in English. So it's like maybe we're just not defining it the way it should be, rather than that being a failure of concepts.
So I think this is a really great point to bring up, because here's something. I love what's going on. So I'm playing the let's throw away the classical view, and you're all bringing up some really great points in response that are saying maybe there is something going on here. Because as you all point out, one of the major things about the way people have approached concepts is through this idea of the lexical concept, the concept that corresponds to a word of the language. But as you all have just pointed out, there are many words that English has which other languages don't have words for, and there are many things that other languages have words for that English lacks. So what we might think in this sort of case is that maybe what's going on here is that there's a few different things we could say here. One of them is that maybe underlying this, we have a concept game. And this concept game has very clear, necessary, and sufficient conditions. And it's just, we have this issue of when we try to put that into language, it breaks down because English does not have the words to capture the internal concept of a game. So what I think this view that you have all just brought up, which is a really interesting view, which I have, like, there's no empirical evidence on my part to necessarily say that this is clearly wrong, because there's nothing like everything we've said so far, this view you're bringing up right now is perfectly compatible with it. The idea being that there are necessary and sufficient conditions. It's just they're in the language of the mind. Therefore, when we try to move that concept to the English language, it doesn't line up properly. Or perhaps even something like the concept here, like this is our concept that most closely relates to the English word game. However, and this concept has very clear necessary and sufficient conditions. However, the game, once we try to put it into English, this cannot perfectly capture what's up there, and that's where the fuzziness comes from. So that is a perfectly compatible response that you could give if, like, somebody on behalf of the classical view could give, and as you all have given, to this first problem. And I think the same sort of thing can also be given to the second issue, which is this fuzziness issue. So what is the fuzziness issue of concepts? Anyone know? What is it for something to be fuzzy?
Unclear.
Yeah, it's unclear. I mean, literally, like a fuzzy animal is like, it's unclear where the end is and where the, like, you know, something that has like a hard skeleton, like it's very clear where you want to say that, like a turtle ends and the turtle begins, like it's at the shell. But you get like a really fluffy dog. Like, you say that the fluffy dog, like where do you say the dog ends? Does the dog end here? Does that count as the dog? Is that part of the dog? It's unclear. And so this is the idea with the concept. If there are necessary and sufficient conditions associated with the concept, then it should be very clear what counts as an instance of that concept and what does not. For every single thing we come across, it should be very clear. Is this thing a square or is this not a square? In math, it's very clear. Like, is this a square? Well, if I stipulate that these are all right angles and these are all the same length, then yes, that is a square. This, not a square. There's no in between. And why? Well, because there's very clear necessary and sufficient conditions. However, once we get to actual reality, we have many, many cases that are less clear. So for instance, there are a lot of things we know about furniture. And also, there are a lot of things we definitely know are pieces of furniture. So, a chair, is it furniture? Yeah, chair, furniture. What are other pieces of furniture?
Sofa.
Couch.
Couch. Grace, what did you say?
I said sofa, but
Okay,
bed.
sofa, couch. What else do we got? Just shout them out, type them up. Desk, table, bed. Bed, table, desk. So we all have very clear cases, but then there are some things that are a bit less clear. So like a clock. Does a clock count as a piece of furniture? Well, it seems like a big grandfather clock would, and maybe like your tiny little like Apple Watch doesn't. But what about like one of these clocks that's like this big and round and hangs on the wall? Is that a piece of furniture?
Like decoration.
Yeah, it feels like a decoration. And then maybe like, what about art? Like, does something count as art? Like, if you have like a sculpture in the living room, is that a piece of furniture? What if it's a sculpture of an oversized chair that nobody's designed to sit on? Is that furniture? Like, and yeah, context can totally change how you define the thing. And so here's another issue. Yeah, art is subjective in its own right, which is going to cause a major problem. Also, like a carpet, is a carpet furniture? Marie, you're doing a great job because when you look up, you are capturing in the face exactly my feelings of this, which is like, I've never really thought about this. And like, this is really exactly the issue. So the issue of fuzziness is that if we have necessary and sufficient conditions, it should be an easy yes, no. Yes, this is a piece of furniture. No, it's not. Because furniture is a concept that we seem to clearly understand. We all are able to apply it. We're all able to get around in the world and think of furniture. However, when you go and look, there are many things that don't neatly fall into or outside of furniture, which suggests that underlying it, there aren't necessary and sufficient conditions. Art is another classical one of just like, because as Scott says, art is totally subjective. So whether something counts as art, it generally seems like what counts as art is that somebody who we call an artist says it's art. And then we have another problem of like who gets to count as an artist. And the more you look at the actual facts of the world, things get fuzzy. To go back, I think it was Holland's point about animals and species. Holland, was that your point? Yes. Whether two animals count as the same species, even something as scientific as like animal is very fuzzy. Like, are two animals in biology members of the same species or members of different species? Well, as a matter of fact, when we talk about mammals, we like to say there's a very clear definition, the definition of two individuals who can mate together and produce offspring. The problem is, how then do you define different species of asexual organisms? So like a sponge, and like a sponge, I mean like the things at the bottom of the ocean that like we used to use in houses, little sponges. Does anyone know how sponges reproduce? Anyone? They just sprout new versions of themselves like out of their bottom. Like it's basically just like, imagine that like a tiny little baby version exactly of yourself. You clone yourself and it pops out of your foot. So they don't mate. And so there's no way to say that these two things are like the same species. Also, yeah, as Holland says, like, what do we do with dogs? Generally, they say dogs are the same species because they can reproduce. But also, there's something very odd about saying a pug and a Great Dane are like the same species. Even something like French bulldogs. You know that I have not fact checked this, but I'm pretty sure poor little French bulldogs, like the ones that Lady Gaga had stolen this week. They all have to be little C-sections, I've heard, because their little hips are too skinny to give birth to their own little babies live. Like, if that's what's happening here, like, no, they don't even count as a species because they can't even have births. And I think they also might not be able to have normal intercourse because their hips are too small. Like, we've done some screwed up things to some animals. But so yeah, these are sorts of things of like our definition of species is fuzzy. And if we can't even come up with clear definitions in science, then how the hell is it the case that we have things like furniture that counts as if we don't even have necessary and sufficient conditions for species, how the hell are we going to say that we have necessary and sufficient conditions for furniture? Now, again, I think that the point that Holland and Marie were bringing up before about maybe the issue is that underneath we have a clear concept with necessary and sufficient conditions. And that clear concept simply can't be translated into English. That is still a view that's on the table. So I don't think that we've necessarily thrown out this picture or this view of it. But I do think that or a lot of theorists have thought this fuzziness is another reason to think that our concepts don't have clear-cut necessary and sufficient conditions underneath them. All right, everyone on board thus far with the first two issues that we have? All right, the last two that we can talk about are life is another one that, like, we like to think that there's a very clear definition of life. But once you get into the science of it, life is like, the simple word life is damn near impossible. So Holland has an example that she just typed in the chat, but another one is viruses. No one really knows how to define viruses. And it seems like depending on what your interests are, sometimes it's useful to say that viruses are alive. Other times it's useful to say that viruses aren't alive. They're like not a living thing. They're rather like little tiny machines. And it really, so viruses seem to exist in this weird space that's like between a living thing and a non-living thing. So that's another, life is one, like anytime you actually dig into just about anything, it's fuzzy as hell outside of mathematics. Their last two things that I want to bring up are, let's see. We have ignorance or ignorance and error. And then the second one is the typicality effects. Anyone have a preference for what order we go in? All right. So I have ignorance and error written first, so we'll do that one first. Here's the basic idea. This ignorance and error problem, I'm going to focus just on the ignorance side of it. And really the issue here, this is one of the more like famous arguments within, it's originally a philosophy of language argument, but it applies really nicely in philosophy of psychology to concepts. And here's the basic issue. Remember that we said one of the great things of the classical view is it seems like it gives us an explanation for how our thoughts can be about things in the world. So like if we say that our definition or our concept cat has necessary parts like animal, fur, whiskers, etc., then we have a very straightforward explanation for why it is that we're able to have thoughts about cats. Well, I think about something out in the world, and to have a thought about a cat is just to have a thought about something that it's true it's an animal, it's true it has fur, it's true it has whiskers, etc. The issue that comes up is that when we actually analyze our thoughts, it seems like our definitions we have for certain types of things aren't actually sophisticated enough or have enough conditions to differentiate those things from other things that we can have thoughts about. So in our minds, how many of you have ever had a thought about smallpox? Now you've had a thought about smallpox. I just wrote it up on the board. How many of you have ever, well, and now it count, had a thought about measles? So, how many of you think that smallpox and measles are different things? I mean, as a matter of fact, I'm told they are. So in my mind, I have a smallpox concept and I have a measles concept. So on the classical view, our smallpox concept is going to have conditions 1, condition 2, condition 3, and the measles concept will have measles condition 1. I guess I can do this. Measles 1, measles 2, measles 3. So to have a thought about a case of measles is to have a thought about something that meets all these conditions. And to have a thought about smallpox is to have a thought about something that meets all these conditions. Now, here's the issue, though. Do any of us actually know much about smallpox or measles? Like, I personally know very little about them. In fact, like, does anyone want to try to give a definition of smallpox? Like, what would your definition of smallpox be? What is in your concept of smallpox? A disease. Yeah, that's about all that's in my concept, too. A disease.
Wouldn't
You know what
look at
else?
symptoms?
That's about the only thing I have in my concept for measles, too. A disease. So it seems like the only conditions that are in my concept, like if I actually were to analyze the things I know about smallpox, I get as far as a disease, and yeah, maybe related to chicken pox, and measles is like, I think there's a vaccine for it that a lot of people don't want their kids to take for reasons that make no sense. Like, that's about as much as I know about these. And yet, so the classical view is going to have to say, well, then you really can't have a thought about smallpox. Yeah, and so Gavindra says, aren't the symptoms how we define them? I mean, as a matter of fact, yes. I think we define some of these things in terms of symptoms. But as a matter of fact, I know nothing about what the symptoms are. Like, if you told me that measles causes you to like grow feathers, I'd be like, yep, that sounds right. If you told me I'd imagine with smallpox, it's a pox that's small. But honestly, I can't get any further than that. So the issue here is we still want to say, like, I can have thoughts about smallpox. Like, it seems like I can have a thought, smallpox is bad. And I could teach you things like smallpox is bad. This is ignorance, Holland. This is the ignorance issue. So the issue is that it seems like many of the things that we have concepts for and that we can have thoughts about, we don't have definitions for. In fact, we know so little, we can't differentiate those things from other things that we also have different concepts for. However, we still want to be able to say that if I have a thought about smallpox, it's different from my thought about measles. This is how the argument goes, which suggests that my having a thought about smallpox is not a matter of my definition, because my definition is just a disease. And that's not enough to pick out cases of smallpox compared to everything else. My case, because, you know, if it's just a disease of some sort, then my concept of smallpox would apply to smallpox, to measles, to any other disease I don't know much about. So the idea is supposed to be there must be something else that makes my concept smallpox about smallpox. It can't be that there's a definition that's doing the work. There's got to be something else. Now, what this something else is, that's a different question. But this is the idea. The idea is most of us are ignorant about many of the things we have concepts of. And yet we don't want to say we can't think about those things. We still want to say I have a smallpox concept. Our concept of, so the idea is supposed to be that we are able to, like, I can have a thought about smallpox, and I can have a thought about, here's the, like, let me draw up the structure of the argument.
Would you say that the mental representations, the concepts and definitions that we have about certain items do not actually define or represent the items that they truly are?
Exactly. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. The basic idea is like, if you accept the classical view. So step one, we have thoughts about smallpox and we have thoughts about smallpox. 2, we have different thoughts about measles. 3, temporary conclusion. So we have a measles concept and a smallpox concept. 4, but my definition of smallpox and my definition of measles are the same. Conclusion, my concept, smallpox and measles are not definitions. So that's the structure of this argument, is in some sense, we have thoughts about smallpox, and those thoughts are different than our thoughts about measles. So if this is right, then we have to accept we have a measles concept and a smallpox concept, and those concepts are different. So but if you actually look at how I define measles, what I know about measles, it's a disease. That's all I know. What I know about smallpox, it's a disease. That's all I know. So if you actually look at them, my definitions, like what I know about them, can't differentiate between the two. I'm ignorant. However, despite this ignorance, you would say something like, well, give me one second. Despite the fact that your definition is, despite the fact your definitions are different, it seems, or your definitions are the same, you've got different concepts, therefore, your concepts cannot be definitions. So Holland asked, does our definition of measles include that it is not smallpox? So this, I think, is a really clever thought, and it's one that I've kind of dabbled with in my own head, but I think there's some issues that it runs into. Does anyone have any idea of what so I don't think, Holland, to be clear, I don't think that this is definitively an argument against this position you just put forward, but I think there's going to be some potential problems here. And I think one of the potential, does anyone, so Holland's suggestion is, why not just say that part of our definition of smallpox is not measles? What is the potential worry? Does anyone have any idea of what a problem that could come up with, or a problem? So yeah, one thing that Conrad says, you cannot define things through the process of elimination. And one thing that's going to come up here, Holland, is that you're going to have to include many, many different things. And many of the things that are going to be in your definition of what measles is that it's going to, you're going to have to say things that haven't been discovered yet. So for instance, we want to say that my understanding of coronavirus is that it's different than measles. And yet and so it seemed like this would require that when I gained the concept coronavirus, part of what was in my concept was not measles. And Joey says you can just say it's not everything else. I think this is, you kind of want to say yes, just say it's itself and nothing else. The problem with that is there are going to be cases in which we do want to say two things are ultimately the same thing in some sense. So for instance, like Batman and Bruce Wayne, your Batman concept and your Bruce Wayne concept are different, but also part of your Batman concept is the same person as Bruce Wayne. So there's going to be cases. What if we combine the concept of an individual thing that is unique from other things in at least some way with the concept of smallpox? So I think that this is a line that some people have wanted to argue, is you say that the definition of smallpox is that it is a unique thing that is different from all the other diseases. It's an individual that is by definition unique. And that's what makes it different from measles. The problem again is that I'm not sure whether that's actually going to be able to give us enough information to differentiate cases of diseases that, sorry, I'm just rambling right now. Give me a second to collect my thought. Concept of an individual thing that is unique from other things in at least some way with the concept of smallpox. So the idea would be that smallpox has underneath it uniqueness as part of it. I'm just not sure whether that would succeed in differentiating it from measles, which would also have this idea of individual thing, unless you like indexed it. So this would be unique, individual, one, unique, individual, two. And I think so. I think you're correct on this, Holland. We might be able to differentiate these two apart, but we're still going to run into the problem of how is it that my smallpox concept is about smallpox. And I might be able to say like it's definitely different from my concept of measles, but what is it that makes it about smallpox? And so it was one thing that the measles concept is supposed to do is say that like differentiate it from all the other diseases, but it's also supposed to allow me to have thoughts directly about measles itself. And it's supposed to be the fact that my understanding of what measles is like is what allows me to think about measles. So yeah, I think you're right that the individual, if you tied these into individual concepts, we'd be able to differentiate them apart. So you'd be able to say that measles has like, it is an individual, therefore it has to be different by definition from smallpox. So I think that that would be able to capture this version of the argument, but I think we're still now, if we had a separate argument, which is we have thoughts about smallpox. But my knowledge of smallpox is limited. So my knowledge of smallpox isn't sufficient to pick out cases of smallpox and make my thoughts about smallpox. Conclusion: what makes my concept about smallpox must not be a definition. So I think this one might be harder to get around with just indexing, because it's also supposed to be that your concept is what allows you to have that thought about something in the world. And it seems like one of the issues with the classical view is what's supposed to be allowing you to have that aboutness in your thought is that you are able to give knowledge which differentiates the things in the world. And this is saying, but in many cases, we don't have that degree of knowledge. All right, so the last thing, any last question on this? Thank you all for these really great responses. These are some really great points that are really allowing us to dig into some of these core ideas. Any other questions on ignorance before we move on? Can you have degrees of definition? So Holland, what I think, so what all of you are saying right here is actually the perfect transition, which is that one of the things that people have wanted to say, and one of the main movements from these sorts of worries about the classical view is that people have started moving into definitions or understanding concepts in a more probabilistic way. And so instead of just saying like something is or is not, and a concept should be thought of as a clear-cut black or white definition, they often like to think of it more in terms of it, and that's prototype theory. So what you all are pointing to is prototype theory, which is going to be the focus for next class. So I think actually I was going to go over the typicality effects, but I think the structure might work better if we save, because basically just to give a preview for next time, or just kind of putting this in context, what people did as a matter of like historical fact is, inspired by things like fuzziness, some psychologists started doing tests on people's concepts and how we apply them. And one of the main things are these, like, one of the commitments of the classical view is anything that, like, so the classical view would say, like, your definition of penguin is that underneath it is bird, and your definition of robin underneath it is bird, and your definition of big bird is bird. And so on the classical view, it shouldn't matter which concept you're talking about. They're all equally bird concepts, and they're all equally good applications of bird. Now, what we actually see is something different. What we see is that people have different views of what counts more as a bird or less than a bird. And they did all these psychological studies that we'll talk about next time. But this led people to think maybe what's in our head are not like straightforward definitions, but rather kind of probabilistic definitions. We have a number of features that define what it's more of, is like we have associated with a game, we have like a paradigm or a prototype game in our head. And what we do is we think like, by game, this activates our concept, which is an image of like the most gamest of games. So I don't know, whatever your idea of what the most game is. And then when we judge whether something is a game, what we're doing is seeing how far the particular thing we're thinking about goes away from that prototype case. So why is it that we still want to say solitaire is a game? Well, it's missing some of the more common features, but it's still got enough that it counts as a game. Why is it that we want to say that a penguin is less of a bird than a robin is? Well, because penguins are missing a lot of the other features. So that's what we're going to be, so it also ties into the typicality worry, which is that, well, this is the typicality worry. It's just this idea of we have more typical examples. The classical view doesn't allow for typicality differences. For the classical view, you're either if you're a bird, you're 100% bird. If you're a penguin, you're 100% bird. If you're a robin, 100% bird. So nobody should have different judgments. But as a matter of fact, people have different judgments. Therefore, our concept robin or a concept bird is not just something which is tied in. Pluto, a planet or not, is another really good one. So I just rushed through that typicality stuff. So I'm going to come back to this next time and give it its proper due. I just wanted to give like a general painting. And because of this, what it led to is this prototype theory. So what we'll talk about next time is how the prototype theory really grows out of this argument against the classical theory, and then show why people, given these problems with the classical theory, move towards the prototype theory, and what all the things that the prototype theory gave that the classical theory did not. I want to make sure that
Professor, is prototype theory like the idea that when a concept is brand new, people collectively agree upon that definition, and it sort of sets a precedent, and then other concepts sort of spawn off of that, and then their validity is based off of the precedence of the first concept?
I think that's one way to think of it, but rather than talking in terms of concepts, it might be useful to say that the way it works is that the concept is built off of the first case that is classified under that concept. So for instance, the first computer then the concept is defined by looking like that first computer. And then what else counts as a computer over time? than in terms of what was set in that initial case.
So is that like Aristotle's like essence idea?
It's going to be more tied in with the Aristotelian essence idea than like the Platonic sort of view, yes. So it's not going to be exactly the same. Also, I need to reaffirm myself to my Aristotle knowledge. It's been a bit, but it's definitely closer along those lines of the idea of there being an essence that defines it. And as long as, well, I guess for Plato, there was an essence too. It's just that essence could be defined. While Aristotle had less in terms of the explicit definitions.
Mhm.
All right. So that's just to paint. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking about the typicality effects in a little more detail, and then show how these typicality effects then gave rise to the prototype theory, and the idea of what the prototype theory is really being this core new view that instead of thinking of our concepts as definitions, we more think of them as a core case, and then we apply the concept by seeing how close some new thing is to that core case. All right, any last questions on this? All right. In that case, I will say have a good rest of your week, have a good weekend, and I will see everyone on Monday. Thank you all for a great discussion